bootcamp is entitled Future of Play, Technologies and Toys. So maybe first a question to you, also in order to get to know you. Who has ever been involved in shaping the future of technologies and toys in one way or the other? Yes, and some volunteer who would like to say in which way and how?
I work a lot with escape rooms, so I design physical toys and objects for escape room design.
Okay, thank you.
I ran the Scratch programming language online community for 6 years and participated in development of that.
Okay, thank you. Other people would like to share their experience? Maybe a complementary perspective?
I attempt to design intense, collaborative, physical, embodied play experiences. I'm not quite sure what I'm shaping in the future. But, this includes somebody mentioned fantasy pretend play and technology. I've done some things with that.
Yes?
I didn't design anything, but I play many games, and I think I was datified so much that I think it leads to many developments in the games.
Yeah, because I wanted to say that actually we're all co-designers in one way or the other with the technology that we're using today. We're appropriating it, we're using it in our own way, we're leaving traces, we're co-shaping, actually we're influencing other people's way of using technologies. Well, when thinking about technologies, actually, and especially also when we're thinking about the play and the future, we're kind of challenged with kind of a wicked problem, so to say. That is a problem that is not defined. It's really hard to say. We had someone making a very wise remark that's like, when we're thinking about play, what does it mean play? Just saying, it was Andreas, when we're observing kids saying like, it was fun, yes, but what does it mean? What does it mean play? And how do we operationalize that? And we might all, I might again ask you questions, and like, what does play for you mean? And depending on your way of defining play, actually we might go into a different direction when we're thinking of the future of play. And on the one hand, when we're thinking about the future of technologies and toys, there are a lot of functional challenges involved, like how to build them from a manufacturer's point of view, from a designer's point of view. But it's more than those functional challenges alone. It's also
I just need to look quickly.
Yeah, we forgot that.
Sorry.
No worries.
Functional challenges.
Yeah, that's a functional challenge. And it's
So now you folks on the video can hear what Bieke is saying. Welcome to the talk.
welcome people in a remote area. We're here in a very hot room. That is also something you cannot hear, so I will give you more senses. But I will not talk about smell. But it's better now. Whatever, functional. Let's keep to the functional first. Well, there are a lot of functional challenges, like what can we do with it? Is it efficient? Of course, when we want to do things in life, we want to reach our goals and not bother too much and in terms of cost or time being lost to stupid things. But when we think about new technologies, more and more we're also aware of the social challenges involved. And I think today at the bootcamp, we've been discussing a lot of social challenges. They go from communication, communicating with and through toys, but also identification. We're talking about relationships, socialization, learning, play, all these kind of social challenges that are really important. And so the question is really how to reconcile these challenges, the technical and the social challenges. And maybe telling a bit more about who I am. I'm Bieke Zaman from Belgium. It's okay. I took the opportunity to correct it here, but that's fine. We're talking Dutch as well. And I have a background in communication sciences. But already as a master thesis student and then later on as a PhD student, actually I started realizing that whatever social sciences research that we're doing often it remains isolated. And we're having so many brilliant insights. And we're studying and critiquing existing technologies. Some media scholars also look at technologies from the past, like Meredith nicely showed to us. But I felt that actually we have so many rich insights that might also shape the next generation of toys. And why waiting for those technologies to be launched on the market to then say, hey, that's not good for this and that reason, and it sucks on that and that reason. So let's think about how to reconcile the technical and the social together. And that's actually how throughout my PhD research and now as working at the Meaningful Interactions Lab at KU Leuven. I'm head of that lab of brilliant people. And we're all looking at the challenge of reconciling the technical and the social challenges. And hence our research is to be situated at the intersection of social sciences research on the one hand and human-computer interaction research on the other, or more focused today, child-computer interaction. And so this brings me to a lot of questions that we're asking at our lab, but also that we have been asking here today at the bootcamp, how to connect technical and social transformations. And now what I would like to do, and that this is nicely a nice build-up actually in the bootcamp program. We've been looking at the past in order to put things into perspective of today. We've been looking at the present with Giovanna Mascaroni, looking at the in-depth practices and rich practices of how we engage and how families engage with Internet of Toys. But what I would like to do, and building upon that continuum, that chronological perspective, I would like to look into the future, how to shape the next generation of digital play, and we can then discuss whether that next generation is fundamentally different or not. We have a nice background about that thanks to Meredith's talk. And then also the question is, how can children co-design their future of play? Many of you have raised a hand like I felt like co-shaping the future in terms of the technological engagement, but how can we involve children in that process? And so my talk will be focusing actually on these three questions, and I will guide you through a lot of projects that we've been doing at the Meaningful Interactions Lab at KU Leuven, and how we were challenged to pick up those challenges. And I won't say we're succeeded all the way, because this is not really a true or false or correct or false exercise, but at least how in our intentions we aim to empower children, to involve them in co-shaping their future of play. And the way I will structure my presentation is actually around a big strand of research which I would put under the umbrella of value-sensitive design. There are other terms coined in the community, like worth-centered design. But I like this term a lot because what you see here is it puts values at the front. And together I feel in this combination of value-sensitive design, we acknowledge we're talking about designing technologies, but on the other hand, we do so in a way that we are sensitive to those social transformations that we are shaping in the same way. By structuring my presentation, actually, I would like to structure my presentation on via three building blocks that are actually three types of investigations researchers do when they are dealing with value-sensitive design. On the one hand, it's conceptual investigations, and I will start by that. And here I will actually also to a lot of knowledge that both Meredith and Giovanna have already pointed to. Then secondly, I will talk about empirical investigations, and finally some technical investigations. First of all, focusing on the conceptual investigations. Well, of course, when we're thinking about technologies, it's good to have a mapping of what are current technologies at our disposal, technologies that do characterize our digital landscape, so to say, to understand what is a design space in terms of technological challenges characterized. And actually, when we map a lot of the dominant technologies today that some people might call emergent, but they're already here and now, very present, then actually, according to the study of Royackers and colleagues who nicely mapped it out, actually there are 3 dominant technologies worthwhile mentioning: Internet of Things, robotics, biometrics, persuasive technology, virtual and augmented reality, and digital platforms. And then this made me wonder, how does this link to actually the phenomenon and the realm of Internet of Toys? And actually, Internet of Toys is all about today's dominant technologies. It's to be situated within the Internet of Things. It is about robotics, like today has been mentioned. Robotics that are penetrating in the children's toys worlds and families' homes, linking to the internet. But it's also about biometrics. We've seen the Cosmo detecting faces. Some Internet of Toys applications do recognize and detect voices as well. And I haven't highlighted things like persuasive technologies, but in one way or the other, it's giving us cues how to behave. This in a certain sense, it's also shaping our behavior in a certain desired way. And the question is, what is that desired way? And what kind of norms or conceptualizations, mental models are underlying these models of Internet of Toys? And there are a variety, as I will show at the end of my presentation. It's also linked to digital platforms. Think about a broader structure of, and then I'm coining some terms about Giovanna's presentations about the political economy, like the surveillance, the datafication, where does the data go to, where is it being resided, what kind of economic values maybe drive the design of the technologies. Technologies on the one hand, so Internet of Toys is really about today's dominant technologies, but it's also linked to certain public values. And also in the study by Royackers and colleagues, they first of all map out what are prevailing public values. And again, they come to a list of 6. Apparently all good things come with 6 in their publication. And they list privacy, autonomy, security, human dignity, justice, and a balance of power as the most prevailing public values. And again, I've taken this as an inspiration and then projected it in my conceptual investigation. What does it mean for the prevailing values related to the Internet of Toys? And then this is my interpretation. I think privacy, security are the 2 prevailing themes, that values that pop up in the discourses surrounding the Internet of Toys. And we saw some evidence in Giovanna's work where she did some media discourse analysis. And indeed, when we look about discourses surrounding the Internet of Toys, it's talking about data protection because we're capturing information about the child, but also family members, but also friends who come over and visit, and there's no parental concern whatsoever. So actually, those people who are using it and those indirect stakeholders who happen to visit that family and interact with the toys, actually are sharing data without really knowing or having control over it. So the question is data ownership. Where does the data come, where does it go to? And will it become the data, or will it be owned by the company? And there we're challenged with this distinction of what is actually really private sphere, that is the home, and then suddenly the public sphere, that is the manufacturer who is keeping the data. So the private-public is definitely blurring. And then because of the technology, the biometrics, we're also capturing data on who we are. So data about identification and recognition, and I know it's the term, the affective stickiness, the fact that we're sharing our emotions. It's nice how I can come third and then use some smart words. So this actually means that there is not only a matter of identification of the individual, but also the individual's emotions, which goes even one step further into a private zone. In terms of security, we've seen the screenshots in the presentation, the hacking, how, for instance, Kayla doll's data has been hacked. Luckily, there are a lot of ethical hackers for these Internet of Toys trying out and challenging the companies. But I've been talking and having several conversations with representatives of the European toy industry, and they said that actually it's for the toy manufacturers really a territory they are unfamiliar with. They're familiar with, and that's why I added safety, with all the safety ergonomics and in the International Standardization Organization, ISO. They have lots of norms and standards to apply for in terms of the safety of toys, and I'm sure Meredith is familiar also with that. And so in terms of making sure that it's not consisting of smart pieces that children can swallow, but also in terms of the materials, that when you suck on it, you're not poisoned, let's say. So safety concerns, they kind of know what to do, but suddenly now the security and the privacy issues come. Those manufacturers really, they do not have the body of expertise in their company, so it's not always a matter of not willing to comply with it, but often a matter of being in a transition and not having the personnel. So that's also a reason why actually there are not that many companies launching Internet of Toys applications, because especially for the smaller companies, they're a bit hesitant to do that, and they not always have the necessary expertise. So I've been talking about conceptual investigations, the technological level, the value level, but there is also, of course, when we talk about the future of play, there is also the notion of what is play, and what is play today is connected play. And I like this term because of two interpretations. On the one hand, there is a connectivity and the connectedness in the sense of data that is being captured and connected to online interactions, often market interactions. That's inspired by work by Cameron, Kramer, and of course José van Dijk. But on the other hand, I also like the notion of connected play by Jackie Marsh, who says that actually connected play means that actually we're connecting spheres that traditionally we have seen as dichotomies, so like a binary distinction between what is offline and online, what is digital and non-digital. And I think as an audience here attending the bootcamp, we're all talking about those blurring distinctions, and for us it doesn't matter actually. Does it matter whether it's digital and non-digital? Do we have to see it as binary, or can we see it as something blurred, something that's it's hybrid in a sense. So the word hybrid is something I'd like to prefer, because it shows that actually it can coexist. So these were some elements that I think there is a lot of, and I've just pinpointed some existing studies, but there is a lot of research on those conceptual investigations. Also talking about the macro trends in terms of the datafication of society, for instance, sovereign society. These are all very interesting conceptual investigations that do not lend itself to measure it or not easily. When we talk about measuring, then we're actually diving into the empirical investigations. But then I would like to think about not only empirical investigations to understand how we interact with technologies and today's technologies, that is part of it, but also empirical investigations, how we can think of and measure our future interactions with technologies. So in terms of empirical, I'm focusing on studying existing practices, but also studying potentially new interactions with technologies. And here comes in the research trend on participatory design. This is not new, and I heard some of you are having a background in interaction design, so you've been studying also the body of literature on participatory design. It already started early roots in the 60s, more prominently in the 70s. In Scandinavian countries, it's where we find the roots. Driven in its original sense by a moral and an ethical commitment to involve the people who are actually the ones who will be using the technology in the future, to involve them in the design already and not to wait until design is being launched and then confront people with something they have never had a say in shaping it. We also see that there are lots of participatory design efforts for a more pragmatic commitment, with the idea is that when you involve people that you're actually designing for in the design process, you will get a better product. There is lots of discussion about what participatory design is today and what it can mean in today's digital society. I will not go too much into detail, but especially there are also lots of discussions about the moral commitment in its original sense, which was almost political one, whether we should continue having that as a main driving force. But I think the ethical layer is an important one. That is, that whatever we're designing for a future, that ethical sensitivity is important. That is, that we have to think about who are we designing for, and that depending on the stakeholders involved, there might be other values at stake, and maybe and very often conflicting values. And then these empirical investigations and the participatory design approach helps to at least put those values on the table, make them explicit, and engage in value negotiations. Whether that's always successful, that's another thing, but at least it's making it explicit. What I also like about participatory design is that it comes with a certain epistemological stance. That is, how do we gain knowledge? And the epistemological stance is one of gaining knowledge through doing, through the act of doing, whether it's research through design or through the act of collaborating with people in order to get knowledge. And I will give more examples about that later on. In order to structure this second part of value-sensitive design, namely empirical investigations, I will be focusing on key principles of participatory design, and then reflect a bit on the projects that I've been doing in the realm of participatory design and Internet of Toys. The first driving principle for value-sensitive design is genuine participation. And in essence, we're not just taking from children what we need for research. That is, we're launching a big survey, we're asking them, please fill that out, and that's it. Or we're doing an interview, but actually we're not giving lots in return. Now, thanks to the fact that we have to submit all the research through institutional or ethical review boards, the community is more reflective, like in terms of what do we give back. But actually, with genuine participation, we want to go one step further and think about how can we even empower children through their involvement. And in order to think about the ways in which we can involve children, actually I like Ornstein's model, his ladder of participation. It's not that often cited in the PD community, in the participatory design community, but I like it because it also gives us a lens to think about certain strengths that we see in research linked to citizen science, the involvement of citizens in science, but also the public sociology and the public pedagogy. I'm not from those fields, but I know it's connecting to those, and that's why I wanted to mention that in order to have a nice discussion afterwards. What is it? It's to be read from bottom to top, and actually it goes from various ways in which citizens can be involved in research and in science, from starting from two layers that we what I wish not to do because of unethical manipulation, and non-participation in essence. But then there comes some involvement, like informing. That means like we're, for instance, asking kids to to talk about their current experiences, and that's informing research. It's better than nothing, but it's only a small step in that ladder of participation. And then it goes up until the bottom through partnership on an equal position to even those layers where we as a researcher give power to the citizen, or in the case of research with children, to children themselves. And what we see is that in the community on child-computer interaction, there are nice definitions of how we can involve children on these layers. So I definitely invite you to, or can share those links with you if you like to have more information. But the fact that I'm telling this is that actually I also want to reflect on some of the projects we've been doing at the Meaningful Interactions Lab, and we were actually where we were aiming for partnership, and that is to say, like, okay, we're having children really as a co-designer. And I also want to confess some of the challenges we had. So, and also tell a very true and honest story that notwithstanding our genuine intentions, let's say, that we're often facing with some project challenges that make it hard, and that eventually throughout the process, especially when it's a process that follows several iterations, oftentimes you end up here where children are informants, and then maybe a bit more partnership at one moment and back. And I want especially to reflect on an Internet of Toys project that we've been doing at MintLab. Maarten van Mechelen was a leading author for many of the publications on that project. It was a national grant that we got, and it was part of a funding scheme where actually they wanted to bring academia and industry together. That's important to know as a disclaimer. So that meant that in order to get a good proposal, and I was a proposal writer and eventually also the research lead when the project was awarded, we actually had to make sure that there was a clear technological challenge, because we were evaluated on a technological challenge, and so we were working together with, for instance, a 3D printer manufacturer. So we had to know that the end solution, whatever it was, would have also 3D printing involved. So that was already something we knew from the very outset. Then we also had a big company who's creating many of the Magic the Gathering cards, etc. It's Carta Mundi. It's a Belgian company, but is world well known. And that company is known for creating cards and now also having like a digital department. So we knew that the end solution would have cards some way and also a digital component, because that's what it was all about. So it's really interesting to see how it all started. And then there was our team, and we wanted to do the user research with at least children as high up in this ladder as possible. And also we were concerned with things like 21st century learning. And again, your visional learning also determines like how you might shape the eventual product. Well, throughout the empirical investigations, we did start by studying like how is the technology today being appropriated, and we understood that we do not have to look at how children use technology at home only, but also at school. So we had two use settings: the home, school. So that meant that in terms of stakeholders, we were talking to children and observing children mainly, but also their parents and their teachers. Okay, great. We did observations, interviews. We were focusing on very young children, preschoolers, 4, 5, 6 years old. So there also comes the methodological challenges, how to involve them in research. But eventually, we had to deliver something, because there was a project for 2 years and the end result was a proof of concept. So we had to make sure we had a proof of concept. So it was also my responsibility together with the industrial project lead, and I'm the research lead. So we had development weeks. So it was an entire week, teams come together. And in those weeks, a lot had been decided, and because of practical concerns, the kids were not really involved in those weeks, but we took the user research into account. So there comes a question of general participation. We were actually confronted with time demands, and I remember the team, they were gathering data for Co-rea, involved in development. Everything went so quickly. So in terms of general participation, we might conclude to some extent at some moments, yes, there was direct influence, at other moments it wasn't. So my message is that whatever we read about this in theory, that sounds wonderful, but I can tell you, as soon as you start, you're confronted with many challenges. And I think that's okay. We have to be honest about it. And we have given a very honest account in a book chapter in the edited book by Giovanna Mascaroni and Donnell Holloway. And we have really described like what were the decisions that we've taken within the constraints of that project, and how did we deal with that? How did we deal with that? Also part of the user data that we got, and I thought I will share this. Of course, we had many insights, but I will share 2 insights with you because it's also characterizing some of the challenges when we're designing for the Internet of Toys. We've launched a big survey among parents of children who at that young age, and it struck us that actually, or maybe not, the majority of parents told us to prefer physical and material play over digital play. And that was also something that came back later on in the project when we were talking about parents that actually they did like a lot of the Internet of Toys applications because it puts their children away from the screens. For those parents who said to prefer digital play, they said they were driven by that learning and digital computational skills a lot, and they had a more nuanced perspective. What we also did next to surveying parents was looking at the customer reviews that we could find online. And from those product reviews, we saw that actually in terms of parental mediation, that many parents said like, us intervening was just a necessity with this young age group. And I think in the presentations before, we saw some instances of parents needing to intervene. These hybrid toys are often connected to a tablet or a smartphone, which are the ownership of the parents, especially when it concerns smartphones. They don't like to share it with their kids. Tablets, there are often a few family tablets in the house, but the smartphone is something different. So that meant that there is always some barrier that avoids them to use it independently. Also, these toys, what we also know from our research, they're not always like in the mother tongue language of the children. So especially for young children, there was also a language barrier that played a role. So these were a few of the insights that we knew and that actually informed our research. So it was, I wouldn't call it design requirements, but at least a sensitivity of the context for which we were designing. A second principle, so the first principle of participatory design referred to genuine participation. The second principle is mutual learning. And this refers to a two-way process. On the one hand, it refers to researchers who learn about the actual use context and also the politics of the place. On the other hand, it also refers to the envisioned end users who learn about technological options. And I want to say two things about that. First of all, about the last one, here comes a bit of the potential empowerment for kids through the act of being involved in a process. They actually might get a better literacy of what these technologies might entail. And there I can definitely refer to the work of Iverson and colleagues who are also here at Aarhus University, who have written about computational empowerment, for instance, through participatory design processes. Secondly, the second remark that I would like to make with regard to this slide is actually the fact that designing is all about understanding, is about creating. So the way we understand the problem is actually the way we will find a solution. So hence this is really important. That's actually also one of the characteristics of a wicked problem, and that's not only linked to design theory or the domain of design. Wicked problem originates from policy domains. So it's let's give a very simple or a difficult example that's not in the realm of design. When you think about poverty, what is poverty for you? Does it have to do with health? Does it have to do with education? Maybe there are other reasons, and depending upon how you define that problem, then you might have to, or then you're looking into other directions for a solution. Is it indeed with regard to health? Is it with regard to education? Or is it financial? What other cultural participation? So depending on how you unravel a problem is actually, the more closer you get to the problem, the closer you get to the solution as well. And that's underlying this notion of mutual learning. It's also linked to the fact that in order to learn from each other, it asks for active cooperation and then collaboration together, which participatory design is all about. In terms of mutual learning, the question is, how do you do that? In the project that I was just talking about, the national project that we had on the Internet of Toys, there we used a lot of creative techniques ranging from brainstorm sessions and workshops to storyboard evaluations, which is making the potential future a bit tangible and more concrete to grasp, and hence also easier to critique and comment on, to initial prototyping testing. And again, I would like to reflect to the extent that we really succeeded in our participatory design approach. And for that, actually, I like the model by Sanders and Steppers, who actually map out the approaches that you can follow when you're doing design-oriented research with people. And there are, or without people, there are actually two axes. On the one hand, you have here on the vertical axis, you can see whether your design is led by, or your research is led by design versus led by research. So the question is it research-oriented design or design-oriented research? But also, you can put it here on the horizontal axis, whether users act more as a subject or an informant to users as a partner. And here you hear again the word partner to partnership, which is higher on the ladder of participation. And when we look back at our involvement in the project, actually I would say that we were more in this user-centered design space rather than really in the participatory design space, because of some of these practical constraints that we were facing. A third principle underlying participatory design is co-realization. Co-realization or co-design, it's that active cooperation where we learn through the act of making, learning through doing. And that's not only the fact that we're making prototypes and testing these, but that's also that through, for instance, let children prototype their ideas with very simple materials. We let them do certain things in order to reflect upon what their needs are or how they envision their future. And this, through the act of making, they often can express some knowledge or some needs that are rather latent and are hard to express in words. And also the act of making something is also a matter of decision making, because it means that you have to make choices how to give shape and how to give form to certain creations. So that's part of a participatory design. And it's also that moment where value negotiations can be made more explicit. And that is value negotiations by not only understanding existing, but also how it might shape future practices. And by value negotiations, I really want to say that this is not something like having a list of values and then try to identify this is the one, because these values tend to emerge in action. So there the idea of understanding how it's situated is really important. Actually, the conceptualization of values as hypothesis is something that I like more. And there, Jafari Naimi and her colleagues have written a very nice publication on. And it goes back to the etymological roots of hypothesis, is to put under scrutiny. And I like that approach because it's forces the researcher to think of what is a situation that demands action, and in that situation what values are driving certain people, and acknowledging that depending on the situations other values might be demanded, let's say, but also depending on which perspective, from which stakeholder. So that's a way where these values might emerge and at least become at the decision table. I know that in the research on Batya Friedman and her colleagues, they also talk a lot about values, but I tend that in their research they advocate more an identify logic. That's as if it is to be identified, and then almost in a quantitative way you can start off weighting them. And there might be situations where sometimes you can quantify it, but I like to see a more holistic approach where we see these values as situated within a certain context, and hence accounting for the fact that these values are dynamic and might also even evolve over time or depending upon stakeholder perspective. In terms of this co-realization, I would like to actually share some of the knowledge that PhD students, former PhD students and current PhD students of mine have been performing, and of which I was a proud supervisor. And I would like to focus on three directions of research that have been performed, again, all driven by our experience in participatory design and the kind of friction between what it is in theory and how it sounds and how to really make that work in practice. And the first one is, well, when you indeed have a bunch of children engaging in these workshops, thinking about the future, of course there are some group dynamics that play a role. And there I can refer to the work of Van Mechelen and colleagues 2015, where they actually studied what are these challenging group dynamics and how to account for them. And actually a lot is in the preparation of your protocol. It's not because you're running a workshop and that you say, okay, we're having a table and a bunch of people together, that it will work. You really have to think about that. What materials are you using? How many? How do you put them together? Which role are each of the children assigned? How can you build it up? You cannot just ask them to immediately sit together and think of the future. Really, it needs a nice build-up. And so in that study, it's those group dynamics are being studied from social interdependence theory to have a theory-informed, to make theory-informed decisions about a protocol. Then there is also a question of how big is your group. Oftentimes researchers work with schools because that's also easy and practical, or for instance in a museum context where you have lots of children together. How do you do that when you have these high child to adult ratio? How do you deal with that? And also that is being published in more recent work by Van Mechelen and colleagues in 2019. And then there is also the question about when we really want to engage children in research, then there is a question of how to put them on the ladder. And the higher we put them on the ladder, the more control we give them. But the question is also how to give them control over the methods. Because eventually we are deciding whether they are being invited for an interview or workshop and so on. And so in the research by Selina Schepers and colleagues, we have been reflecting on what if the child becomes a process designer and the child can co-shape and co-determine the methods for research in participatory design. So these are all lessons learned from our empirical investigations and also how to deal with certain challenges that we have been documented in previous research. The last typology of investigations that fit in that big umbrella of value-sensitive design are the technical investigations. And technical investigations really resemble what we've been seeing today, and it's being coined by words as affordances or scripting, inspection. In my jargon, I've been referring to it as affordances. Why the term affordances? Because affordances is actually referring to, on the one hand, some properties of an artifact, but also some action probabilities and potentialities. It's not deterministic in a way, but it's saying that in one way or the other, an artifact can invite people to engage with it in a certain way. And the observation came actually from a post hoc reflection on that research grant that we got about the 3D printing and the industry collaboration and that project. And I felt that we did a great job, at least in trying to involve the children and their parents and the teachers as much as possible. But I felt that by only doing those empirical investigations, we were not telling the entire story. And that's how I actually decided to do a post hoc analysis of the 3 designs, the prototypes, that were developed as a proof of concept as part of that project. That was a 3D printed figurine, of course, but that was also a bracelet that was also a trend, customization and personalization. We picked up that trend very nicely because we had commercial people. So that was a bracelet that could be commercialized. And then we had a robot. We picked up that trend as well, and cards because we needed cards, and Lego because Lego is popular amongst kids. So these were actually the 3 designs. And then I thought, like, what we've been studying so far is about what parents think about it, how parents mediate and intervene. But what about those child-toy interactions and the agency, accounting for the agency that goes out from these designs? And hence, I put a focus on those design qualities, and I was looking at, rather than describing them, how they were built, and those descriptions we got, like in terms of what sensors were in there or what connections were in it, I thought, like, maybe we have to think about that intermediate level knowledge, those instances that actually are at a more abstract level, not the grand theories, but at a more abstract level, to describe what these technologies may afford, and hence also involve in a more ethical, reflective discussion about what these potentially may invite children to do. And I will summarize some of those outcomes of that technical investigation, and you will feel it was totally complementary to what we found in the empirical research. So hence, I feel that both approaches complement each other very well. First of all, we felt that for these 3 prototypes, they could be categorized on a spectrum from autonomy supporting versus dominant based interactions. And I will give a few of the examples. The conceptualization of this bracelet, for instance, that gave almost all autonomy on children to negotiate its potentiality. It was really fostering open-ended play. It didn't come with like rules of gameplay. Actually, children could wear it. It had some colors so that you could form teams if you like. But how to appropriate it was rather open, actually, open for appropriation. For the robots, actually the robot was conceived as a playmate, and there the toy and the child were put in rather an equal position. Whereas for the 3D figurine, actually the child had to wait for instructions and then learn through feedback what would be considered as good. And also here, the idea was that it would have a display and present the outcomes, for instance, of a learning process. But that resembled kind of a tutor-pupil model, where there is some kind of good answer in the head of this figurine. So that was the first kind of continuum. The second continuum that we found was that there was also spectrum ranging from predefined versus fluid boundaries. And here the bracelet is a very nice example of it, because the bracelet actually categorized a heterogeneous network, because there were no clean boundaries between what the user or the object would be. The idea is that you would wear the bracelet, but actually your locus of attention would be on the surroundings, but the bracelet would also keep an ID, a personal ID of the kids. It was the idea that actually whatever the child would do in terms of learning, but also like identification, was stored on the bracelet, and the bracelet would also be unlocking, for instance, a digital sphere in the online world that was child safe. But then it was, because of that capturing of that information, it would be uncertain where the intellectual power would reside, and how actually the child or the bracelet could store a datafied version of the child's identity, which the child could not really control, because you see there are not, that would all be predefined in the settings. The third and last spectrum that we discovered was that from dependence to independence. And there each concept actually had some properties, and then what you see is that actually some of them allow children to act independently, or sometimes it was how the object itself acted independently or not. And here comes this notion of certainty and uncertainty back, which was also coined in some of the previous presentations. And here we were reflecting how this dependency or independency would actually allow people or create certain expectations, and then also potential mismatches in expectations. So in a conclusion, what is a presentation all is or is all about is that actually when we're facing this challenge to find a coherence between technology, context and people, that it's not only instructive to question how technologies are shaping the way children behave, think, interact and socialize, but also like how people and also children are invited and actively involved in shaping future technologies. I thank you for your attention.